My dad can't afford a lawyer, so I'm here to speak for him.
A 10-year-old black boy, oversized white shirt, a leather briefcase dragging near the floor. Judge Preston Caldwell, the most powerful man in Hadley County for 22 years, stopped and stared.
What is this filthy little black rat doing in my courtroom? Somebody call the pound.
Victoria Ashton, the plaintiff's attorney, crouched down.
Your daddy is nothing, boy. You are nothing. Nothing gets swept out with the trash.
Attorneys smirked.
Drag
The
this
clerk
thing out.
recorded on her phone.
This building is for civilized people.
A bailiff leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Not one adult said, "Stop." 10 years old, alone against every person in that building. But none of them had any idea. Because before that afternoon was over, one question from this black child would end Judge Caldwell's career. A grown man in a judge's robe just called a 10-year-old boy a rat, and nobody flinched. I'm Kane Uncovers. I dig up the stories people bury on purpose. This one was buried under 22 years of silence in a courthouse in South Carolina. Hadley, South Carolina. Population 9,000. One main street. A dollar store. 2 churches. A courthouse older than most of the people who walked through its doors. If you drove through Hadley on a Sunday afternoon, you might call it charming. You might notice the oak trees lining the road, the old brick storefronts, the American flags hanging from every porch. What you wouldn't notice, unless you looked carefully, was the line. Not a line drawn on any map, a line no one talked about. The line between the side of town where the potholes got fixed and the side where they didn't. The side where new condos were going up, and the side where buildings were being torn down. The side where code inspectors never visited, and the side where they showed up every other month. Hadley was being developed. That was the word they used. Development, progress, revitalization. What it really meant was this. One by one, the small black-owned businesses on the south side of town were disappearing. A barber shop, a laundromat, a grocery store that had been there for 40 years. Each one sold, sometimes willingly, sometimes not, to a company called Whitmore Development Group. And every time a dispute arose, every time a black family tried to fight back, the case landed on the same desk, the desk of Judge Preston Caldwell. Caldwell had been on the bench for 22 years, white, 63 years old, third-generation Hadley. His grandfather had been a judge. His father had been a judge. In this county, the Caldwell name didn't just carry weight, it was the weight. No attorney in Hadley would dare challenge him. No ruling of his had ever been overturned. And if you were black and standing in his courtroom, the verdict was written before you opened your mouth. Everyone in Hadley knew this. Nobody said it out loud, because the last person who did, a young black attorney named James, who filed a complaint about courtroom bias, found himself audited 3 times in 1 year. His office rent doubled, and his biggest client suddenly gone. The message was clear. In Hadley County, justice had a color, and it was white. On the other side of that invisible line sat a small auto repair shop with a faded sign that read, Lewis & Sons Garage. The paint was peeling. The parking lot had cracks running through it like veins. But the tools inside were organized with military precision. The floors were swept every night, and a framed photo of a woman with a warm smile hung on the wall near the cash register. That woman was Andre's mother. She had been gone for 5 years now. Clarence Lewis, Andre's father, was a quiet man who fixed engines the way a surgeon fixes hearts. Carefully, patiently, with hands that knew exactly what they were doing. He had bought this land with his wife 22 years ago, back when they were young and full of plans. The garage was everything he had left of her. It was Andre's inheritance. It was the last piece of a life that illness had stolen, piece by piece. He was behind on taxes. Not because he was careless, because medical bills from his wife's cancer treatment had swallowed everything. Every savings account, every emergency fund, every dollar set aside for Andre's future. On the wall behind the register, next to the photo, hung a framed document, a property deed. Clarence would point to it sometimes and say, This paper means they can't take what's ours. He believed that. He had to. Now meet Andre. His bedroom looked nothing like a 10-year-old's room. No posters, no toys scattered on the floor. Instead, a twin bed pushed against the wall, a desk stacked with books, property law, civil procedure, contract disputes, and sticky notes covering the wall above it like a detective's evidence board. Lines of string connected one note to another. Names, dates, case numbers. Since his mother died when he was 5, Andre had stopped being a normal child. Not by choice, by gravity. The weight of what he saw. His father working 16-hour days, the bills piling up, the notices arriving in the mail, pulled him somewhere most children never go. His grandmother Ruth had given him her old paralegal textbooks when he was 7, thinking he'd flip through the pictures. Instead, he read them cover to cover. By 8, he taught himself legal terminology and case citation. By 9, he was reading civil procedure for fun. His school called him gifted but odd. His teachers said he was quiet. The truth was simpler than that. Andre wasn't quiet. He was listening, and always writing. He carried a notebook everywhere, a worn, spiral-bound notebook with a blue cover. Every conversation he overheard at the garage, every notice his father received, every name on every document that passed through the shop, Andre wrote it down. Names, numbers, dates, details no one asked him to remember. That notebook would become the most dangerous weapon in Hadley County. The papers arrived on a Tuesday. Andre was sitting on a stool behind the counter at the garage, doing math homework, when the door opened and a man in a gray suit walked in. He didn't need his car fixed. He handed Clarence a thick envelope, said, "You've been served," and walked out without another word. Clarence opened the envelope. His hands were still black with engine grease. He read the first page, then the second. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then his hands began to shake. Whitmore Development Group was suing to claim the Lewis property. The lawsuit alleged that Clarence's deed contained a boundary line error, that a strip of his land, including the western wall of the garage itself, actually belonged to a parcel Whitmore had recently purchased from the Henderson family next door. The company demanded that Clarence vacate within 60 days. If he refused, they would seek forced removal. 60 days. 22 years on this land, and they were giving him 60 days to disappear. Clarence stared at the papers for a long time. Then he said, almost to himself, "I don't understand half these words." Andre put down his homework. He slid off the stool. He walked over to his father and gently took the papers from his hands. He read them slowly, every word, every clause, every citation. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved faster. When he finished, he looked up at his father and said, "I do." That night, Andre didn't sleep. He sat on the floor of his bedroom with the lawsuit papers spread out in front of him. He read the complaint 4 times. He highlighted every legal term he didn't understand, then looked each one up in Ruth's paralegal textbooks. By midnight, he understood the case better than Clarence ever would. And what he understood terrified him. This wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a machine, designed to crush people who couldn't fight back. Over the next 2 weeks, Clarence visited every attorney he could find. The first one, a man with a fancy office and a golf trophy on his desk, told him it was a losing case. "You're going up against Whitmore in Caldwell's courtroom," he said. "That's not a trial, that's a sentencing." The second charged a $10,000 retainer just to review the file. Clarence didn't have $10,000. He barely had 10. The third, the only black attorney in the next town over, a man named James, who wore kind eyes and a tired suit, leaned forward and spoke quietly. "Mr. Lewis, I took a case against Whitmore once. Caldwell threw it out in 40 minutes. After that, my office got audited 3 times in 1 year. My landlord raised my rent. A client I'd had for 6 years suddenly switched attorneys." He paused. "I'm sorry. I want to help. But going against Caldwell in this county, it's not just a case. It's a sentence." Andre was in the back seat for every single visit. He said nothing. But his notebook was open on his lap, and his pen never stopped moving. He wrote down every name, every excuse, every reason these grown men gave for looking away. He was building something in that notebook. Not just notes, but a map of how power worked in Hadley County. How one man's name, Caldwell, could make 3 attorneys turn away a father begging for help. The following Sunday, the family gathered at Grandma Ruth's house for dinner. The table was crowded. Collard greens, cornbread, sweet tea, and mason jars. But the mood was heavy. Everyone had heard about the lawsuit. Neighbors whispered. Some were sympathetic. 2 of them, the Hendersons included, had already sold their homes to Whitmore under pressure. A 3rd family was packing to leave. The pattern was obvious to everyone. The courage to name it out loud was not. Ruth Adams, 72 years old, retired school teacher, Andre's grandmother, sat at the head of the table and listened to the adults talk about what couldn't be done. She let them finish. Then she said, "They smile at you while they steal from you. That's how it's always been. Different names, same hands." The room went quiet. Ruth had lived through things the younger generation only read about. When she spoke about injustice, it wasn't theory, it was memory. Then she said something else, something she didn't think twice about, something that would change everything. "You know," she said, spooning greens onto Andre's plate, "when Whitmore bought the Henderson place, the survey markers moved overnight. I saw it with my own eyes. One day the marker was by my fence post. Next morning it was 3 feet east. 3 feet. Like magic. Bad magic." Andre's pen stopped. He looked up. "What do you mean, they moved?" Ruth waved her hand. "I mean what I mean, baby. One day here, next day there. Nobody explains nothing to old women." Andre didn't say another word for the rest of dinner. But under the table, in his notebook, he circled one word 3 times. Moved. That night, in his bedroom, the light stayed on past midnight, past 1, past 2. Ruth's paralegal textbooks were spread across the floor. The lawsuit papers were pinned to his wall. The framed deed, he'd taken it off the garage wall and brought it home, sat propped against his desk lamp. Andre was copying numbers onto graph paper with colored pencils, drawing lines, comparing boundaries. His finger traced 2 different lines, one from the original deed, one from the lawsuit. They didn't match. His eyes narrowed. At 2:15, Clarence knocked on the door. "Son, sleep." "I will, Dad." He didn't. He stayed up until dawn, hunched over graph paper, checking and rechecking. And somewhere around 4 in the morning, in the silence of a house where a good man slept and worried and prayed, a 10-year-old boy found the thread that would unravel everything. I need to stop here, because this is the moment that decides everything. A 10-year-old boy, sitting on the floor of his bedroom at 4 in the morning. His father is about to lose the only thing he has left of the woman he loved. 3 lawyers said no. The judge is corrupt. The system is rigged. Nobody is coming to help. Nobody. So I'm asking you, before I tell you what Andre did next, what would you do? If you were 10, if every adult around you had given up, if the only weapon you had was a notebook and a stack of books nobody thought you could read, would you sit still? Would you stay quiet? Or would you pick up that pen and fight with the only thing you had? The next morning, Clarence sat at the kitchen table staring at his coffee like it owed him something. He hadn't slept either. Andre walked in carrying a folder, not his school folder, a manila folder thick with papers. He placed it on the table in front of his father and opened it. Inside was a handwritten document, neat block letters, a child's careful printing. The title at the top read, "Motion for Andre Lewis to appear as pro se representative on behalf of Clarence Lewis." Clarence stared at it. "What is this?" "I looked it up, Dad. In South Carolina, if a person can't afford representation, the court can permit a family member to assist in presenting their case. It's unusual. Nobody's done it with someone my age. But the law doesn't say I can't." Clarence set down his coffee. "Son, you're 10. And they're wrong, Dad. That's all that matters." For a long moment, neither spoke. The refrigerator hummed. A bird sang outside the window. Clarence looked at the motion his 10-year-old son had written by hand, with citations he didn't understand, but that were formatted perfectly, and his eyes filled with something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. He didn't say yes. Not yet. Instead, he drove Andre to Ruth's house. He figured his mother would talk sense into the boy. Tell him this was foolish. Tell him to be a child and leave the fighting to adults, even if the adults had given up. Ruth listened. She sat on her porch in a rocking chair, hands folded in her lap, and she listened to every word Andre said. When he finished, she didn't speak for a long time. Then she stood up, went inside, and came back carrying something Andre had never seen before. A leather briefcase, old, cracked at the edges, but solid. "This belonged to your grandfather," Ruth said, holding it out with both hands. "Elliot Adams. He wanted to be a lawyer more than anything in this world. Applied to law school in 1961. They sent back a letter that said, 'We regret to inform you that your application does not meet our current admissions criteria.' That was the polite version. The real reason was the color of his skin." She opened the briefcase. Inside, tucked into the lining, was a handwritten note on yellowed paper. "The law belongs to those who study it." He carried this briefcase every single day of his life, Ruth said. To work, to church, to the grocery store. He never got to use it the way he wanted. She looked at Andre. Her eyes were steady and bright. "You will." Andre held the briefcase with both hands. It was heavy, not because of what was inside, because of what it carried. From that day, Andre had 1 week before the hearing, and he used every hour. At the Hadley Public Library, he sat cross-legged on the floor between the shelves, surrounded by books on property law and land disputes. The librarian, a white woman named Mrs. Coleman, who had never once asked why a 10-year-old was reading court opinions, brought him printouts of case precedents. She didn't ask why he needed them. She just helped. Once, she leaned down and whispered, "If you need anything else, you come find me." Andre looked up at her and said, "Thank you, ma'am." It was the first time in 2 weeks anyone outside his family had offered to help. He walked the boundary of his father's property with a measuring tape and his notebook, marking every survey stake he could find in the ground. Some had been there for decades, rusted, leaning, half-buried. Some looked newer, cleaner, straighter. He wrote down every measurement, every position, every difference. He went to the Hadley County Records Office. A 10-year-old boy, standing at the counter, asking for the original deed and survey records for both the Lewis property and the Henderson property, the one Whitmore had bought. The clerk behind the counter, Tanya Moore, hesitated. She was a black woman in her 30s who had worked in this office for 8 years. She knew what those files contained. She knew who they involved. She looked at the boy. She looked at the briefcase in his hands. She looked at the request form he'd filled out, in perfect block letters, every field complete. Then she quietly pulled the file. She didn't say a word, but the look she gave Andre said everything. Finally, someone is looking. At Ruth's kitchen table, index cards were laid out like a chessboard, each card written in careful block letters. A fact, a question, a possible objection, a response. Andre rehearsed cross-examination questions out loud, while Ruth played the opposing attorney. She was sharp. She didn't go easy, not even on her 10-year-old grandson. "Objection, Your Honor. The respondent's representative is a child." "The law doesn't have an age requirement for truth, ma'am." Ruth smiled. Again, louder this time. They practiced every night for 5 days straight. Ruth threw every objection she could think of. She interrupted him. She talked over him. She mocked him. She wanted him ready. Not for a fair courtroom, but for Caldwell's courtroom. And by the end of the week, Andre could recite his argument, answer cross-examination, and present his evidence without looking at a single note. On the last night, Ruth ironed Andre's one good shirt. Andre polished the cracked shoes himself, tongue between his teeth, concentrating. He packed the leather briefcase. It was almost too big for him to carry. He carried it anyway. And inside that briefcase, among the folders and index cards and printed precedents, Andre had placed something he'd found in the county records that changed everything. Something no one, not Whitmore, not Ashton, and certainly not Judge Caldwell, expected anyone to find. But that comes later. The morning of the hearing. Mist outside. The garage sign was visible through the kitchen window, still faded, still standing. Clarence wore his best suit, the one from his wife's funeral. Andre wore his ironed shirt, the sleeves still a touch too long. Neither spoke much. At the front door, Clarence knelt down and put both hands on his son's shoulders. "Whatever happens in there, I'm proud of you." Andre looked at his father. "Nothing's going to happen, Dad, except the truth." The old car started on the second try. They drove through town in silence, past the dollar store, past the church where Andre's mother was buried, past a Whitmore development billboard advertising luxury townhomes. The future of Hadley. Andre stared at it. His grip on the briefcase tightened. They arrived at the courthouse. Andre stepped out of the car, briefcase in both hands, shirt ironed, shoes cracked but shining. This was the moment from the beginning. The lobby, the insult, the laughter. But now you know what Caldwell didn't. Now you know what Ashton didn't. Now you know what every smirking face in that building didn't. The kid with the briefcase wasn't lost. He was loaded. The night before the hearing, hours before Andre polished his shoes and packed the briefcase, he made the discovery that would bring down the most powerful man in Hadley County. It started with the county records. Andre had been cross-referencing two documents, the original Lewis property deed, filed 22 years ago when his parents bought the land, and the boundary survey that Whitmore Development submitted with the lawsuit. The survey claimed the Lewis property line was 14 feet east of where Clarence had always understood it to be. 14 feet. Just enough to place the western wall of the garage on Whitmore's land. But when Andre overlaid the original county survey grid, the one recorded when the land was first platted, the numbers didn't match. The starting reference point was different. Whitmore's survey used GPS coordinates that were offset from the original reference monument, not by accident. By exactly 14 feet. The exact distance needed to steal a strip of the Lewis property. Andre remembered what Ruth had said at dinner. The markers moved overnight, 3 feet east. So he checked the Henderson property survey next, the one Whitmore had used to acquire the land next door the previous year. Same surveyor, Walter Gibson. Same offset, same direction, same 14 feet. Two properties, same surveyor, same shift, same company, same result. This was not a mistake. This was a method. Andre wrote in his notebook, "Gibson moved the line. He moved it for Henderson. Now he's moving it for us." But that wasn't the golden clue. The golden clue came 20 minutes later. Andre was flipping through the county financial disclosure records, documents that every elected official in Hadley County was required to file annually. He'd requested these from Tanya Moore, along with the property records. Most 10-year-olds wouldn't know financial disclosures existed. Andre wasn't most 10-year-olds. He had read about judicial conflicts of interest in one of Ruth's textbooks, Chapter 12, page 216. He'd underlined the key sentence: "A judge must recuse himself from any proceeding in which his impartiality might reasonably be questioned, including cases involving a party with whom the judge has a financial relationship." He almost missed it. A single line, buried on page 9 of Judge Preston Caldwell's most recent disclosure. Investment interest, Whitmore Development Group, LLC. Shares acquired, value $185,000. Andre read it again, and one more time. Judge Preston Caldwell, the man assigned to preside over Whitmore's case against the Lewis family, was an investor in Whitmore Development Group. He owned a financial stake in the very company that was suing Andre's father. Every piece of land Whitmore acquired made Caldwell richer. Every ruling in Whitmore's favor put money directly in Caldwell's pocket. The judge was not neutral. The judge was the enemy, and he always had been. And it was all written down, filed with the county, public record, sitting there for years waiting for someone to look. Nobody looked. Not the attorneys, not the other judges, not the journalists, not the politicians. A 10-year-old boy looked. Andre sat at his desk for a long time. His hands were shaking, Not from fear, from understanding. He finally understood why every black family lost in Caldwell's courtroom, why no attorney would take their cases, why the system worked so perfectly against them. It wasn't just bias, it was profit. Then he picked up an index card, a single 3x5 card, and wrote one question on it. He underlined it twice. He placed it in the front pocket of the briefcase. That night, a 10-year-old child held the most powerful man in Hadley County in the palm of his hand, and Caldwell had no idea. Courtroom B. Wood-paneled walls, an American flag, the state seal mounted above the bench. 30 people packed into the gallery, mostly black families from the South Side, people who had come to watch because the Lewis case was their case too. If Clarence lost, they all lost, and they knew it. When Andre walked through the door carrying that leather briefcase, the room went still. He walked to the respondent's table, his head barely rose above it, and set the briefcase down. He opened it. He laid out his index cards in a neat row. He placed one folder to the left and one to the right. Then he sat down, hands folded, feet dangling above the floor, and waited. Victoria Ashton let out an incredulous laugh. "Your Honor, this is absurd. There is a child at counsel's table. He can't be more than 10 years old." Judge Caldwell looked down from the bench. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Irritation, amusement, contempt, all three at once. "Boy, who are you, and what do you think you're doing in my courtroom?" Andre stood on his toes so his voice would carry. "My name is Andre Lewis, Your Honor. I'm here on behalf of my father, Clarence Lewis, the respondent in this matter. I've filed a motion requesting permission to assist in presenting his case, under the court's authority to ensure fair representation for parties who cannot afford counsel." He held up the handwritten motion, clean, precise, every citation correct. The courtroom murmured. Caldwell took the document. He read it slowly. His jaw shifted. He flipped the page, read the citations, flipped back. Then he looked at Andre with an expression that had changed, not to respect, but to something harder to read. Wariness, maybe. The first faint recognition that this was not what he expected. "Who helped you write this?" "The Hadley Public Library, Your Honor. It's open to everyone." A few people in the gallery smiled. Caldwell did not. "I'll allow it," he said, his voice flat. "Provisionally. But I will be watching very closely. One misstep, and you're done." "Understood?" "Understood, Your Honor." Victoria Ashton delivered her opening statement like a woman who had already won. She was smooth, polished, unhurried. Every sentence was designed to make the Lewis family look like they were clinging to a mistake. She presented Whitmore Development as a pillar of the community, a company investing in Hadley's future, creating jobs, raising property values. The boundary survey was conducted by a licensed professional with 26 years of experience. The law was clear. The math was clear. The line was the line. "This is not about history," she said, straightening her jacket. "This is not about feelings. This is about where a line is drawn on a map, and the map is clear." She sat down. She didn't look at Andre. Andre stood. He had to push his chair back to make room. The briefcase was open on the table behind him. His index cards were arranged in a row. His feet barely reached the floor. He didn't try to match Ashton's polish. He couldn't. But his voice was clear and steady for a child, the voice of someone who had practiced this in his grandmother's kitchen 100 times. "My father has owned this land for 22 years. That's longer than I've been alive. My mother is buried in the church 3 blocks from our garage. The deed hanging on our wall has been valid for 2 decades. Nobody questioned it. Nobody challenged it. Not until Whitmore Development decided they wanted it." He paused. He looked at the gallery. The faces he recognized from the neighborhood, from church, from Sunday dinners. Then he looked at Caldwell. "Ms. Ashton says this is about a line on a map. She's right. But the question isn't where the line is. The question is who moved it and why." The courtroom went dead silent. Not the polite silence of waiting, the electric silence of people realizing something had shifted. Then Ashton moved to cross-examine Clarence. She started gently. "Where did he grow up? How long had he owned the property?" Simple questions to build rapport. Then the blade came out. She asked if he was a surveyor. No. A lawyer? No. An engineer? No. Had he ever studied property law? No. Had he ever read his full deed before this lawsuit arrived? Clarence hesitated. I read most of it when we bought the land. Most of it, Ashton repeated. So you're asking this court to take your word, a man with no legal training, no surveying credentials, no education beyond high school, over the assessment of a 26-year licensed professional. Clarence sat up straight. He looked at her, and for the first time all day his voice was steady. I'm asking this court to look at the truth. Andre watched from his seat. His jaw was tight, but he didn't intervene. He wrote a note on one of his index cards. He knew exactly what Ashton was doing, trying to provoke him into an emotional outburst so Caldwell would have an excuse to shut him down. Every instinct in his body wanted to stand and object. He stayed seated. He stayed silent. His pen moved across the card, because he had something bigger coming. Something Ashton didn't know about. Something Caldwell didn't know about. Something hidden in the front pocket of a dead man's briefcase, written on a 3x5 index card in a child's block letters. One question. That was all he needed. Caldwell called a recess for lunch. But before the gavel came down, he leaned forward on the bench and looked directly at Andre. Not with contempt this time, with something colder, something careful. Boy, I've given you more patience today than you deserve. When we come back this afternoon, I expect evidence. Real evidence. Documents. Numbers. Not speeches. Not feelings. If you don't have anything to show me, I will rule on what's in front of me. He let that settle. And what's in front of me is a licensed survey and a valid claim. Are we clear? Yes, Your Honor. Good. Recess until 1:30. Ashton gathered her papers and smiled. Not the tight smile of someone performing confidence. The real smile of someone who believed she had already won. She leaned over to whisper something to the Whitmore representative, and they both looked at Andre and shook their heads. Caldwell stepped down from the bench and disappeared through the side door. The gallery emptied slowly. Some people stopped to touch Clarence's shoulder. Most just filed out in silence, their faces heavy with the weight of inevitability. In the hallway, Clarence sat on a wooden bench and put his head in his hands. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His body said everything. The curve of his back, the way his fingers pressed into his temples, the slow shake of his head. 22 years of work. His wife's memory, his son's future. All of it balanced on a hearing that felt like it was already decided. Andre stood at the hallway window looking out at the town, the rooftops, the church steeple, the Whitmore billboard in the distance. For the first time since this began, his composure cracked, just slightly. His hand trembled as he held the briefcase strap. The briefcase was almost as tall as his waist. He looked small against the window. He looked like exactly what he was, a child carrying something too heavy for anyone his age. Then he opened the briefcase. He pulled out the index card, the one from the front pocket, the one with the single question. He read it silently, lips moving. Once. Twice. His breathing slowed. His hands steadied. His face went calm. He closed the briefcase and held it with both hands. He was ready. That was when Caldwell appeared in the hallway. Not in his robe, just his shirt and suspenders. He walked toward Andre slowly, deliberately, his shoes clicking on the marble. Then he crouched down so they were eye to eye. Close enough that Andre could smell the coffee on his breath. Close enough that the gesture was unmistakable. A grown man lowering himself to a child's height, not out of kindness, but out of power. The way you crouch to speak to a dog. You've got guts, kid. I'll give you that. His voice was low, almost friendly, almost warm. But guts don't win cases in my courtroom. You know what wins? Knowing when you've lost. He straightened up. Tell your daddy to take whatever Whitmore offers. Save yourself the embarrassment. Save your daddy the embarrassment. Andre looked at Judge Caldwell, the man who had called him a filthy rat, who had told his father he was trash, who had spent 22 years deciding who mattered and who didn't, and said, "I don't have a counteroffer, Judge Caldwell. I have a question." Caldwell's smile didn't disappear, but it thinned, just barely, just at the corners, the smallest crack in the armor of a man who hadn't been challenged in 2 decades. He turned and walked away without another word. Outside the courthouse, under the old oak tree in the yard, the black community members gathered. Ruth was among them. She wasn't crying. She was sitting on a bench with her eyes closed and her hands clasped together, praying. Not loudly, not for show. Just a grandmother asking God to steady the hands of a 10-year-old boy carrying a briefcase full of truth into a room full of people who wanted to crush him. A neighbor put her hand on Ruth's shoulder. "That boy has no chance in there, Ruth. You know that." Ruth opened her eyes, slow and certain. That boy has been preparing for this his whole life. He just didn't know it. Tanya Moore, the county records clerk who had pulled those files, was watching from the courthouse steps. She hadn't gone to lunch. She was too nervous to eat. She knew what Andre had found in those records. She was the one who had watched him read page 9 of Caldwell's financial disclosure, watched his eyes go wide, watched him copy the numbers into his notebook with hands that shook. She had said nothing. She had done her job. She had given a citizen access to public records. And now, she was hoping it was enough. The courthouse bell rang. Lunch was over. Andre tucked in his shirt, picked up the briefcase with both hands. Clarence stood. They looked at each other, the tall man and the small boy, and walked back through the courthouse doors together, side by side, step by step. When that door closed for the afternoon session, 30 people held their breath, because a 10-year-old black child was about to do something that no attorney, no politician, and no adult in Hadley County had ever dared to do. Look Judge Preston Caldwell in the eye and call him a fraud. The afternoon session began with silence, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. The gallery was fuller than before. Word had spread during the lunch recess. People were standing along the back wall, faces pressed against the window of the courtroom door. Andre stood and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness." Caldwell raised an eyebrow. "You have a witness?" "Yes, sir. Walter Gibson, the licensed surveyor who conducted the boundary assessment filed by Whitmore Development." Ashton stood immediately. "Objection. Mr. Gibson is our witness." Caldwell looked at Andre. For a moment, he seemed ready to deny it. One more way to tilt the floor. But 30 people were watching. A clerk was recording. So he said, "The respondent has a right to cross-examine." Overruled. Walter Gibson took the stand. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a receding hairline and sweat already forming at his temples. He sat down, adjusted the microphone, and looked at Andre. He had not expected to be questioned by a 10-year-old. Andre began gently, carefully, the way Ruth had taught him. "Mr. Gibson, how long have you been a licensed surveyor?" 26 years. "And you conducted the boundary survey submitted in this case?" "I did." "Could you walk me through your process? Specifically, where did you begin your measurement?" Gibson relaxed. This was his territory, familiar ground. "I started from the GPS coordinates of the county reference marker on the northwest corner of the Whitmore parcel. Standard procedure." "Standard procedure," Andre repeated. He nodded. Let Gibson feel comfortable. Let him settle in. Then Andre reached into the briefcase and pulled out 2 transparent sheets, hand-drawn overlays on clear plastic, traced from the documents he'd studied. One showed the original county plat survey from 22 years ago. The other showed Gibson's survey. He held them up, one on top of the other, and walked toward the witness stand. His head barely reached the railing. "Mr. Gibson, in the original plat recorded with this county 22 years ago, the reference monument on the northwest corner is located at this position," he pointed. "But in your survey, the starting GPS coordinate is here," he pointed again. "That's approximately 14 feet to the east. Can you explain why your starting point is not the same as the original?" Gibson blinked. "It was updated." "Updated by whom?" "The coordinates I used were the most current available. Do you have documentation of that update from the county surveyor's office?" Silence. Gibson's mouth opened, then closed. "I'd have to check my records." "I checked them for you," Andre said. He held up a printed page, the county's confirmation letter, stamped and dated. "There has been no update to the reference monument coordinates for this parcel since the original plat was filed. The county confirmed it. The marker hasn't moved in 22 years. Gibson shifted in his chair. The sweat at his temples was running now. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. Andre let the silence hold for 3 seconds, then 4, then 5. He had learned this from Ruth. She told him silence was a weapon. "Let the lie sit in the air," she'd said. "Let everyone smell it." Then Andre placed both overlay sheets on the table and pulled out the index card from the front pocket of the briefcase. One question, written in a child's careful block letters, underlined twice. "Mr. Gibson, I have one more question." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the ceiling fan turning above the bench. "I also obtained the survey you conducted for the Henderson property, the land Whitmore Development purchased last year. Same county, same neighborhood, same client." He paused. "In that survey, the reference point is offset from the original monument by the same distance, 14 feet, same direction, east. Same result. The boundary shifts in Whitmore's favor." Gibson said nothing. His hand gripped the armrest of the witness chair so hard his knuckles went white. 2 properties, same surveyor, same offset, same client, same outcome. Andre looked directly at Gibson. His voice didn't waver. "Mr. Gibson, did Whitmore Development, or anyone acting on their behalf, instruct you to use a shifted reference point for these surveys? Yes or no?" Gibson's eyes darted to Ashton. Then, involuntarily, helplessly, they darted to Judge Caldwell. That glance said everything. The connection between the surveyor, the company, and the judge laid bare in a single, terrified look. Gibson swallowed. "I was given coordinates to work from." "Given by whom?" "By the client's office." The gallery erupted, voices overlapping. Someone shouted. Ashton was on her feet, objecting. Caldwell banged the gavel. "Order! Order in this court!" But Andre wasn't finished. He waited for the noise to die. He stood perfectly still. The briefcase was open on the table behind him. The index card was still in his hand. Then he did something nobody expected. He turned away from Gibson. He turned toward the bench. He looked up at Judge Preston Caldwell, the most powerful man in Hadley County, the man who had called him a rat, who had told him to leave, who had spent 22 years deciding who belonged and who didn't. And Andre Lewis, 10 years old, asked the question that no one in that courtroom saw coming. "Your Honor, before you rule on this case, I have one final question. Not for the witness, for the record." Caldwell's face tightened. "You're out of order. According to the Hadley County Financial Disclosure Records, public records filed annually, available to any citizen, you, Judge Preston Caldwell, hold an investment interest in Whitmore Development Group valued at $185,000. The courtroom stopped breathing. "If that is true, Your Honor, then you have a direct financial interest in the outcome of every case Whitmore brings before this court, including this one." Andre's voice didn't shake. His hands didn't tremble. He held the printed disclosure page, page 9, highlighted in yellow, and his eyes never left Caldwell's face. "My question is simple. How can you judge this case fairly when you profit from the verdict?" Preston Caldwell's face went white. The gavel didn't come down. His hand was frozen above it. Ashton was standing, mouth open, with nothing to say. The clerk had stopped typing. Gibson was staring at the floor. The gallery was silent. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of something shattering. Something that had held this town in its grip for 22 years, cracking right down the middle. A 10-year-old black child had just broken it with one question. What happened next unfolded in minutes, but it would echo through Hadley County for years. Caldwell tried to regain control. He slammed the gavel once, twice, 3 times. "This is outrageous. This is a child making baseless accusations in my courtroom." "The disclosure is a public record, Your Honor." Andre held up the printed page. Filed by you. Signed by you. Dated last January. Page 9. Ashton grabbed her phone and began scrolling frantically. Her fingers were shaking. The color drained from her face. She had never checked. In all her years working Whitmore cases in Caldwell's courtroom, she had never once thought to look at the judge's financial disclosures. No one had. Because no one had ever needed to. Because no one had ever dared. Because no one had ever imagined that the answer to 22 years of injustice was sitting in a filing cabinet in the county clerk's office, waiting for someone to simply ask. A man in the gallery, a retired attorney who had come to watch out of curiosity, stood up. His voice was calm and clear. Your Honor, if this disclosure is accurate, you are required by the South Carolina Code of Judicial Conduct to recuse yourself from this proceeding immediately. Failure to do so constitutes a violation of Canon 3E. And with respect, sir, everyone in this room just heard the evidence. Caldwell's gavel hand dropped to the bench. He looked out at the courtroom. 30 pairs of eyes, maybe more now, staring back at him. Black faces, white faces. The bailiff who had laughed that morning. The clerk who had recorded the insult. The attorneys who had smirked. All of them seeing, for the first time, who he really was. He looked at Andre. The boy looked back at him. No hatred in his eyes. No triumph. No revenge. Just the steady, quiet gaze of a child who had come to tell the truth and had done exactly that. Caldwell stood, his hands pressed flat against the bench. He didn't speak for a long moment. The courtroom waited. Then he said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "This court is in recess. Indefinitely." He gathered his papers, stepped down from the bench, and walked through the side door. He did not look back. He did not return. Within 48 hours, the Hadley County Clerk's Office forwarded Andre's evidence. The financial disclosure, the 2 matching surveys, Gibson's testimony, to the South Carolina Judicial Standards Commission. An emergency review was ordered. A replacement judge, Judge Martha Simmons, brought in from Columbia, was assigned to the Lewis case. Judge Simmons reviewed everything: the surveys, the offset, Gibson's admission, the disclosure, the pattern. Her ruling was swift. The boundary claim against the Lewis property was dismissed. The survey submitted by Whitmore Development was found to be unreliable and based on manipulated reference points. Judge Simmons further recommended that the Henderson family's case be reopened for review, and that both Walter Gibson's surveying license and Whitmore Development's pending land acquisitions in Hadley County be referred to the State Attorney General for investigation. And Judge Preston Caldwell, 22 years on the bench, untouchable, unquestioned, the most powerful name in the county, was formally suspended pending a full ethics investigation. When the replacement judge read her decision, the courtroom was packed. Every seat taken, people standing along the walls, people standing in the hallway, faces pressed against every window. Judge Simmons looked at Andre and said, "Young man, I have been on the bench for 16 years. I have never, not once, seen a more thorough, more courageous, or more honest presentation in any courtroom in this state. You have done your father a great service. You have done this community a great service. And you have done this court and the law itself a great service." The gallery erupted, not in chaos, in applause, in tears, in something that Hadley County hadn't felt in a very long time: justice. Clarence wrapped his arms around Andre and held him so tight the boy's feet left the ground. He didn't say anything. He couldn't. His tears said everything. Ruth was there, crying and laughing at the same time, the way only grandmothers can. The community surrounded them, hands on shoulders, arms around backs. Tanya Moore stood in the doorway, smiling through tears she didn't bother to wipe. Mrs. Coleman, the librarian, was in the back row, pressing a tissue to her eyes. Andre opened the briefcase. He reached into the lining and pulled out the yellowed note in his grandfather's handwriting. "The law belongs to those who study it." He handed it to Ruth. She pressed it to her chest, closed her eyes, and whispered her husband's name. 3 generations, 1 briefcase, 1 truth. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon light came through the oak tree in golden columns. The same tree where Ruth had prayed that morning. Clarence and Andre walked to the car. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They drove home through town, past the dollar store, past the church where Andre's mother was buried, past the Whitmore Development billboard. Andre looked at it. He didn't stare this time. He just looked, and then he looked away. He didn't need to stare anymore. They pulled into the garage. The old car's headlights lit up the faded sign, Lewis and Sons Garage. Clarence turned off the engine. He sat for a moment. His hands rested on the steering wheel. Then he said, quietly, "Your mother would have been so proud of you." Andre looked at the sign, at the garage, at the land his parents had bought together 22 years ago, with nothing but love and a dream and a piece of paper that said this was theirs. "She already is, Dad." Walter Gibson's surveying license was revoked. Whitmore Development Group was placed under investigation by the South Carolina Attorney General. 11 property acquisitions across Hadley County were flagged for review. 3 families, including the Hendersons, filed motions to reclaim their land. Judge Preston Caldwell never returned to the bench. The judicial ethics investigation found a pattern of undisclosed financial conflicts spanning 14 years and 9 cases, every one of them involving black families on the south side of Hadley. His law license was permanently revoked. His name was removed from the courthouse plaque he had walked past every morning for 22 years. The building he once controlled no longer carried his name. It carried his shame. And Andre Lewis, a 10-year-old boy who walked into that courthouse with a briefcase too big for his body and a question too big for the most powerful man in the county, became the youngest person in South Carolina to receive a commendation from the State Bar Association. Not as a lawyer, as a citizen who, in their words, demonstrated extraordinary courage and commitment to justice in the face of systemic abuse of power. Clarence Lewis paid off the garage's debts that year. He repainted the sign himself, one Sunday afternoon, with Andre holding the ladder. It now reads, "Lewis and Sons Garage, established 2004, still standing. Still standing." I need to tell you something before we go. When I was 12, I watched my uncle lose his barbershop. Not because he failed, because someone with more money and a better lawyer decided they wanted his corner. He stood in the parking lot that last day, holding the keys, and he didn't cry. He just said, "They don't take the building Kane uncovers. They take the belief that you can keep anything." I never forgot that. I wrote this story because nobody wrote his. Because the world is full of Andre Lewises, brilliant, brave, extraordinary people whose gifts are invisible, because someone decided that the color of their skin or the size of their wallet disqualifies them from being seen. Andre didn't walk into that courtroom with money. He walked in with truth, and that was enough. So look at the people around you. Really look. Past the oversized shirt, past the cracked shoes. You have no idea what someone is carrying, and you have no idea what they're capable of. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, hit that like button. It costs you nothing, but it helps this story reach someone who needs to hear it today. Share it. Send it to someone who's been underestimated, someone who's been told they're nothing, someone who's been looked at the way Caldwell looked at Andre and decided to stand up anyway. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week, we're telling another story you won't forget. And drop me a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever walked into a room where nobody believed you belonged? What did you do? I read every single one.